Good morning or good afternoon. I'll call our committee meeting this afternoon to order for finance and facilities. To start, I'll do attendance roll call. Trustee Coles. Here. There we go. Next item on the agenda is approval of the minutes from March 19th. Are there any changes to the minutes? Seeing none, is there a motion for approval? It's been moved in second. I'll do a roll call vote. Trustee Coles. Aye. Mackie, to give an update and jump into the agenda.
Thank you, Chair Hipsch. I won't. One of my updates was related to the allocation framework principles and design features, so I won't repeat what you indicated, but would just add that the presentation sparked a lot of internal discussion significantly among campus leaders and others. So I think there's many looking forward to continued discussion on that topic. The other update that I've been giving regularly this year has been related to the system office redesign and renovation project. And not a lot of new information to report since our last meeting. We're still on schedule, on budget. The goal remains to be operational in the newly renovated space on July 1st. The system office team has been busy working on third floor. Cubicles have been installed, and there'll be a phased-in process of moving staff in starting in mid to late June. And just as a reminder that this project is being financed through system office lease cost savings realized over 5 years due to the reduction in square footage, and that this remodel is providing a professional, equitable, and flexible workspaces to last well into the future for the Minnesota State System Office and its associated activities. So that concludes my updates. My normal budget updates are included within the presentation today.
Thank you, Chair Mackey. Vice Chancellor Mackey. Any questions for Vice Chancellor Mackey? Seeing none, we'll move into our next agenda item, which is the proposed amendments to Board Policy 5.16, Risk Management and Insurance, and this is a second reading.
Chair Hipsch and trustees, before you today is the second reading for the proposed updates to Board Policy 5.16, Risk Management and Insurance. The policy completed its 30-day review with no public comments. As a reminder, the changes to the policy are largely stylistic, updating language to reflect changes since the last time the policy was reviewed. There are no substantive changes with the regular review and no changes since last month. So we are seeking your approval and are available for questions.
Thank you so much. Trustee?
Just a really basic question. For insurance, do each campus buy their own insurance, or do you buy it at the system level?
Chair, trustees, my understanding is that most of the insurance is provided by the state through the state's insurance program, and then campuses are covered by those policies. And then there are some specialty policies that the system office coordinates for the campuses if you have a stadium and you needed specialty coverage for certain kinds of activities, but generally it's provided by the state.
Since this is a second reading, we'll entertain a motion for approval.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. We'll move into roll call vote for this. Trustee Coles. Trustee Janicic. Trustee Jana Johnson. Trustee Jacqueline Johnson. Vice Chair Mo. And the chair votes aye. That is approved. We'll move on to our next item, which is Board Policy 5.18, alcoholic beverages and controlled substances on campus. This is also a second reading.
Chair Hips and trustees, before you today is the second reading for the proposed updates to Board Policy 5.18, alcoholic beverages and controlled substances. The policy completed its 30-day review with no substantive public comments. As noted last month, the changes to the policy are largely stylistic to bring the policy into the format currently used by the Board of Trustees. The one substantive change is on lines 45 to 49 under responsibilities. The policy previously authorized campus presidents to approve the use of alcohol at specific events, but never required people wanting to consume the alcohol to actually seek approval. The policy now requires people to ask and to do so in advance of the event. There are some other additional changes to the procedures, which are approved by the chancellor. And since the last policy review in 2012, at least one campus has obtained a liquor license, and the procedure update will include licensed premises and tailgating. The procedure also reiterates that marijuana and marijuana-containing products remain controlled substances for purposes of the policy, and we seek your approval.
Any changes between the first and second reading?
Mr. Chair, there were no changes between the two readings.
Thank you so much. Are there any questions on this policy? Seeing none, with this being a second reading, I will entertain a motion for approval. It's been moved and seconded. We'll move into a roll call vote. Trustee Coles. Trustee Janicic. Trustee Jana Johnson. Trustee Jacqueline Johnson. Vice Chair Mo. And the chair votes aye. That is approved. Our next item is a new one for this group. Vice Chancellor Bailey is here with some technology policy updates. This will start kind of a series of technology policy updates. And with that, I'll turn it over for first reading to Vice Chancellor Bailey.
Thank you so much, Chair Hips, trustees. This is a first reading of the proposed amendment to Board Policy 5.13, Information Technology Administration. This policy is being reviewed and updated as a part of a 5-year cycle. Primary changes within the policy, which is also in your board packet, are the proposed amendment of one. There are changes to the wording, to provide a strategic work plan instead of a strategic plan. And number two, change the wording to allow more flexibility for a college or university to adopt their own policy or procedures, as well as updating and rearranging the wording for better clarity.
Are there any comments or questions on the first reading for this technology policy?
The policy calls for an IT strategic framework. And I asked Carrie to send it to me, and it's basically a work plan for a workday. Is that what you meant by IT strategic framework?
Trustee Johnson, yes.
It says it informs the strategic plans for each campus. So then you develop a work plan for workday, basically. Okay. And then one other question, if each college you have your own strategic plan, is it a work plan or is it like I guess I have two questions. Is it a work plan or is it like a couple year strategic plan?
Chair Johnson, Chair Hips, Trustee Johnson. At Winona State University, I was a CIO for 15 years. So I went through 5 strategic plans. So what we did was we do 3-year sprints. So we do 3-year strategic plans. They actually, because the system office does what I call institutional technology, as in the enterprise resource planning system, which is Workday, most of our strategic plans tend to focus on the educational technology, how you're applying things like D2L, how you're integrating technology into the curriculum, how you are leveraging technology for student success and for students. So it focused very differently. It was on the nuts and bolts and how you deliver technology to students. So.
I was just going to say, I think it's an interesting question. And I went to the strategic plan, not necessarily the IT strategic plan. And there is always a timing glitch about the September board retreat. And then we kind of already are in session for the year. But fortunately in our system, we've had the same three priorities for as long as I can remember: student success, equitable outcomes, and financial sustainability and growth. So we go through a process every year where we look at what does our data say we need to focus on this year within those three areas. And I think that we're aligned with the system always because of that kind of tier of our biggest priorities and values.
So do we have a strategic IT plan in place for the system?
Trustee Johnson, currently we work off of the Chancellor's full work plan. There isn't a specific strategic plan. However, I will say that in working with our audit partners, it is something that we actually will need to move forward with in creating of an IT strategic plan for the system. So it's a great question.
Thanks. And sorry for the naive questions. I apologize. Do we have a strategic plan for the system? Or is it a work plan? Is it your goals that you present?
Chair Hipsch, Trustee Johnson, it's the annual work plan. There isn't a long-range strategic plan for the system per se. That's a question for the future discussion. I think in the past, the thinking behind being kind of work plan oriented was to be nimble to the changes at the legislature and what was coming our way, and that perhaps long range planning was tried before and things didn't come to pass because of elections and changes at the legislature. I'm not sure. I wasn't around for that part, but it's something we could take a look at. Thank you.
Great question. The only other piece that I'm looking through it on lines 8 and 9, maybe a call out to data, just as data becomes more and more prevalent in our world from a technology perspective, might be something to consider for between now and the second meeting. So with that, since this is just the first reading, there's no action from the board, but this will come back to us again next month. So thank you so much. Our next topic in the bulk of our meeting is really around our fiscal 26-27 biennial operating budget development. And with that, I'll turn it over to Vice Chancellor Mackey.
Thank you, Chair Hipsch. The goal this afternoon is to provide the trustees with an update on the 2025 legislative session, college and university operating budget development, and to discuss tuition parameters for the 26-27 biennium. Discussion in advance of May's board meeting will assist system, college, and university leadership as they continue to develop budget scenarios, as they gather input and feedback from campus stakeholders as the 24-25 academic year is coming to a close. So I think to start I got a presentation. I think that's probably being loaded up right now. That's included in onboard. As we're going through some information, as usual, I have a lot of data points to share to hopefully be useful in helping set context. Oh, I'm having trouble here. There we go. So as we go through this presentation, we're going to go back and forth between looking at the entire biennium for 26 and 27, as well as the immediate task of approving 26 operating budgets and tuition rates, which occurs typically at the June board meetings. Again, the goal is to leave this meeting with additional tuition guidance for our colleges and universities as they continue their consultation processes with their students and other stakeholders. So to start with, the state's budget and economic forecast from February, I think most of us are familiar with that. The February forecast reported that Minnesota's economic outlook worsened from the earlier November forecast. The projected surplus over the biennium for 26-27 was $160 million lower than the November estimate, which leaves a balance of $456 million. And then looking out to 28-29, which is the right side, of this slide. The shortfall is also trending downward, leaving nearly a $6 billion deficit. And Minnesota management budget's projecting that spending growth will outpace revenue growth through fiscal year 29 projections. It was noted that there's much economic uncertainty with this forecast, given the uncertainty at the federal level. Continued policy and fiscal changes federally will ultimately have an impact on Minnesota's budget. Higher education in Minnesota makes up approximately 6% of the state's general fund budget. And of course, it is our primary operating revenue source for our colleges and universities, the state appropriation. This 6% includes funding not only for our system, but also for the University of Minnesota and the Office of Higher Education, which includes the state grant program. So it appears if these projections hold, we could be headed into a future economic environment where we experience a reduction in our state appropriation, like we experienced in fiscal year 2010-2011 biennium and the 2012-2013 biennium. Just to provide a rough idea of the magnitude, if the reduction was applied across all sectors of the state in somewhat of across the board fashion, it would be approximately a $360 million reduction to all of higher ed, and that would be a double-digit percentage reduction for Minnesota State. So provide that context to think about, I think it was asked at the last meeting, to think about things of what the next 4 years looks like, even though in June we'll be setting tuition for the 25-26 year, but being aware of what is coming and maybe coming down the road with the state economy. So moving to this session, this is our board request versus the governor's budget recommendation versus the targets that the Senate and the House have for spending for higher education. The column on the left is for the 26-27 biennium, and the column on the right for 28-29, that would be the ongoing portion of the request in 26-27. So for example, in our request, we requested $465 million. The board approved in November. $285 million was a request for student affordability and system operations, and that's the portion we'll be focusing on primarily in today's discussion. Is that aspect of it. In addition, $40 million for student support and $40 million for workforce. That adds up to $365 million. So we asked for base funding to continue in those three areas. We also part of the request was $100 million for critical infrastructure, which had a demolition program, funding to help with our maintenance backlog, as well as funding to support our ERP conversion. So that's the difference between the 465 and the request in 26-27, and then the 365 would be base and ongoing, the 100 million being one-time money. If we look at the targets, you can see that the governor and the House, essentially for all of higher ed, had zero targets, or there was zero in the budget. And I'll explain later, and I've provided this in earlier updates, that a zero target does not mean that Minnesota State's funding will stay at our fiscal year 25 level. The Senate target of 100 million in this next biennium, and then 25 million ongoing, is focused on supporting the state grant program. And after some reallocation, I think the bill that came out had just over 100 million in new funding in the Senate's bill, along with some changes with the formula to address the program's deficit. So along with our biennial budget request of the 465 million, we had in the request the desire for the board to have tuition flexibility. So the biennial budget request asked that the board be able to set tuition through its extensive consultation process and allow for campus level discussions and decisions to be a significant part of that process. The request envisioned that overall tuition increases would be directly related to the amount of additional base funding received out of the $285 million request. So for example, if we were In a much different circumstance, and we received $285 million, the tuition being envisioned would have been closer to zero. We now know, and will be part of our discussion today, that we're not likely to receive any of that $285 million portion of our request. We also asked, and was which of the board's interest, the flexibility for differential tuition rates for high-cost programs, as well as, costs that are related to programs that are outside of an institution's control. So that's also a component of the tuition flexibility portion of the request that the board approved in November. To provide some history, and you've seen this information several times, but I think it's important context, is that starting in fiscal year 2014, the Minnesota legislature engaged in setting the system's tuition rates either by freezing or limiting increases. So if you see the columns, college tuition and university tuition compared to previous year, you can see that many years tuition was frozen. And if there is an amount in there, there was a cap that was in the budget bill that put a ceiling on what tuition rates could be considered for undergraduate students by the board. So for example, in 2021, in those years, the cap was 3%. And in 22-23, the ceiling was 3.5%. Of course, the biennium we're in right now, 24-25, tuition was frozen and it was fully funded during this biennium. So fiscal year 26, the 25-26 academic year, could be the first time in several years that the board has the flexibility to set tuition. So prior to fiscal year 2014, that's when the board had that. And in Minnesota State Statute, Chapter 136F, provides that the board shall set tuition fees and refunds for the colleges and universities that it governs. So as long-term tuition planning considerations are considered, and this is, thinking about it over 4 years, and again, the numbers we're going to share with you today focus more on 26, 27, and a lot on 26, because that's the immediate task at hand. But also the scenarios that are in your packet related to tuition scenarios, they're very much looking at it from a perspective of operations from a college and university. So increasing college and university operating revenues for annual cost increases. That is a portion of setting tuition, but there's many other considerations. Being able to retain that tuition flexibility, if we're able to get that through as a result of the session. So making sure that there's not a concern from the legislature or others that we're being too aggressive in tuition, and then only have that flexibility for a short period before the legislature intervenes like they did back in 2013. As important, or probably one of the most important things that's talked about is student success and how student affordability relates to that. And that involves several factors. Cost of attendance related to fees, housing rates, as well as availability of financial programs that support our students that have the most financial needs. So setting tuition is not a simple task by any means. There's many factors in it, and I just want to emphasize today, and some of the scenarios are focusing more on a big picture of the operating revenue impact that it has, but these other aspects are as important or more important. So to start with, talking about our appropriation, I mentioned that a no funding recommendation does not mean that our appropriations stay at the 25 level. And I know there's a lot of rows on this chart in front of you, but this illustrates what the difference would be in our 25 appropriation as a system compared to our 26 appropriation based on the governor's budget recommendation. And so pointing out two major items, we plan for some of the one-time funding, for example, the workforce equipment and environment funding, the workforce program development funding. Those were both $6.75 million in fiscal year 25. That was one-time funding. So that is not baked in the assumptions and planning on how to fund ongoing operations. The part that puts financial stress on our system and our colleges and universities are the top two lines under current appropriations, as there's a $22.5 million base reductions in operation support and a $12.5 million reduction in tuition replacement funding. So the $22.5 million is a 3.5% reduction from 25 levels. And then the $12.5 million means that the tuition freeze is no longer fully funded from fiscal year 25. It's partially funded in fiscal year 26 and moving forward. I'm going to go through a couple more and then pause for questions. And currently, right before recess, the House and Senate are working on their higher education bills. I'll start with the House first. The House Higher Education Committee moved a vehicle bill to Ways and Means in order to meet the third committee deadline. After the break, April 21st, when they come back, the committee will have a full hearing on the omnibus bill. As a reminder to the previous slide, the House target was 0. The Senate bill, which is up on the screen, has some components to it that I'd like to explain for a moment. So for Minnesota State, as it relates to our request, the free course materials, $2 million out of the student support category was for continuing work in that area. So there's $1 million in new funding in free course materials in the Senate bill. The Lake Superior College PFAS, there's $1 million in one-time funding, and that's to assist the college with some contamination work that they're doing related to their emergency response training center that's in within West Duluth, and they've been working with the MPCA consultants and others for a significant amount of period working towards resolution, but it's a costly venture. So there's some one-time funding available for that particular purpose. The relocated funds, so you'll see emergency grants and hunger-free campus grants. This bill transfers appropriation that was going to the Office of Higher Education to Minnesota State to make it a direct appropriation. The transfer does show an increase in our base, but it is not a new appropriation. Our students are still benefiting right now from the funding, both in emergency grants and hunger-free campus grants. The reason that the shift would happen in the funding coming directly to Minnesota State was administratively to make it easier. Essentially, the funding is flowing right now through the Office of Higher Education and then coming to Minnesota State. So this would just have it come directly to Minnesota State. So as it relates to their target for higher education, it had a 0 impact on it. So as we've been planning, we've been working with colleges and universities at the system office to get an idea of tuition thinking and what conversations are happening with stakeholders and student leadership on the campuses. And we've taken 2 different occasions to get a sense of what type of planning work was happening in relation to tuition. In January, this was before the economic forecast, we were optimistic and we assumed that we would at least get $45 million in new funding so that our funding would stay at the level at fiscal year 25. In March, we adjusted that to the realization that we're likely to lose $22.5 million and not get any new funding to fill that tail that was there at the end of the 24-25 biennium. Our assumption for tuition replacement, that stayed the same under both scenarios. Our tuition, our inflation assumptions, we made a couple different assumptions. One is that, looking at CPI, which about 3% over the last year, it's varied from 2.4 to 3.5, I believe has been the range. So we use 3 to the average over our contract settlements over the last 3 bienniums, all of our collective bargaining agreements, including the ones that are negotiated by Minnesota State and the ones that are negotiated by the state of Minnesota. Those have averaged about 4.5% over the last 3 bienniums. So we use that as an assumption, some historical information to, have everybody using the same base of assumptions when they were sharing with us their tuition thinking. The first survey, we didn't put any parameters on any ceilings for tuition. The second survey, we said, okay, we don't want anything back that is more than 10%. And this was again looking at it from a long-term financial sustainability operating revenue perspective. So what would it take to, for the most part, to be able to balance your budget if you only have tuition revenue available versus state revenue, especially in that March scenario? In order for that to happen, tuition increases would need to be well into double digits, and we know that that's not feasible for many, many reasons. And this was the last one for a bit. So as a result of this, the first scenarios we got back, we had colleges and universities on the scale from 3.5 to 14. In March, the low and the high end was between 4 and butting up against double digits. I would say that most colleges and universities, and we'll hear in a moment from our presidential liaisons to the committee, are modeling increases that are 8% or pushing up against double digits with their student governments. And just to share some of the challenges and reemphasize them, for setting budgets for fiscal year 26, the cost increases are unknown at the time the board has to approve tuition. Unless something changes significantly this year from any other biennium, none of the labor contracts will have been finalized by the time the board meets to approve tuition in June. And also, you know, and our presidents can emphasize this more, regardless of what level of tuition increase may be approved by the board, every one of our colleges and universities is going to have to implement budget reallocations and reductions in order to cover inflationary costs for fiscal year 26. So I'm going to pause there for a second and turn it over to President Jans to talk about what's happening at his campus, as well as perhaps within a sector, and then President Brimhall will do the same.
Chair Hips and trustees, I'm going to give you a little bit of context and go into our exact process we've been doing. At Winona State, my first year as interim president, we had to reduce our overall budget by $7 million. This last year, we reduced it again by $3 million. That's impacted some of our discussions with our student senate colleagues as I go through our consultation process. It's important to note that within our context, our number one competitor is UW La Crosse. Our second competitor is UW Eau Claire. Third, University of Minnesota Twin Cities. Fourth is St. Thomas. Fifth is Minnesota State University of Mankato. So we have you got to remember, our competitive environment is very different. And if you look at their tuition levels, we're not completely out of range with those kinds of schools. And so again, the students we're trying to attract is a little bit different. So with that, Scott Ellingheisen, my CFO, and I started looking at projections. We're projecting out we're going to be down 2 or 3% in state support. That's just the reality of what we're looking at, the numbers coming in. In addition, if you're projecting even modest salary increases, we were coming up with 9.5% to get us close. And when I say close, we were still probably $1 million or $2 million short. And so, but at least got us in the ballpark of operating the university. This is important because we've had consultations with Liz Carmen, who's our Student Senate President, and through the Student Senate through our meet and discuss process, we laid out what some of the issues were on our campus and what we're experiencing. And what I'll say has not been fun for the last 2 years, trying to get our budget kind of in line. We took this proposal, which is 9.5% tuition increase, to Student Fee Management Committee. It passed unanimously out of the Student Fee Management Committee. It went to the Student Senate floor last week, 2 weeks ago, and this week, and it passed Student Senate. And the biggest thing that our president of our Student Senate said is our students want fully staffed student services in our program to continue. And they say other competitive schools haven't, and we don't want to lose them. And so, so our students are looking to make sure they keep the student services intact. And so that's how we arrived at that number. That's the consultation process we're going. And again, I think our institutional context is important to understand that we have a different competitive landscape than I think other schools do. So.
Chair Hips and trustees, I think we all have and know our colleges and our regions well. So our processes are pretty similar, but they vary just a bit. I'm fortunate in terms of context to have between the CFO and I about 60 years at the institution. And so whatever we give messages to both our students and our employees, they're not new messages. They've heard these messages. We do budget listening sessions on every campus once a semester. So our employees are very aware of all of the factors that go into our budget. I think Pat Nordick's last presentation was 75 slides because he went into the allocation model and everything else, trying to help people understand. And we give that same amount of information to our students. So we'll be doing our third meeting with students next week. And we're modeling out scenarios from 3% to 9%. And then there's a model in between. So we have 3 different columns showing the students what each of those get us to. But we have made our final decisions on our budget. They'll be communicated to all of our employees next week. We cut about $2.5 million because we also made decisions to invest $1 million in different things like marketing and enrollment and new programming. And so we're cutting about $2.5 million, and that is with using some fund balance and with the plan for tuition increases. And so I think that's the reality of our institutions. And certainly my colleagues at the 2-year colleges are in the same position where all of this together doesn't really get us to zero.
So I'm going to walk through in the board packet. There was 3 scenarios to generate discussion related to tuition increase scenarios at a high level, at the system level, and there's been 1 added for this presentation. So just to talk a little bit about where the numbers came from in running these scenarios. And the impact is a bit different at each one of our 26 colleges and 7 universities. So we're showing this at a system level and based on system averages related to tuition increase scenarios. So it may be under any scenario, there may be differences between sectors. There may be differences between colleges and universities within the sector, but ultimately there'll be a system average, however this ends up after the June board meeting. So what we did for our assumptions is that we used information from the 25 November budget update for fiscal year 25, and our total compensation costs in the system are just shy of 1.4 billion. Our operating costs are just over 500 million. And then the tuition revenues projected for this year are about 750 million. For enrollment, we used a flat enrollment between 25 and 26. We've always, at the system level, when we've talked about changes in revenues and expenses, we've always left enrollment at the base level and with the understanding or the assumption that costs are adjusted locally due to changes in enrollment. So for several years, campuses had enrollment declines and they were adjusting. You could see our employee FTE going down at a similar rate sometimes as enrollment. The last couple of years, enrollment's been growing, so in some cases we might see personnel moving in another direction, but that's been the assumption that we've used. I mentioned the inflation assumption. We used 3% for this exercise. We could have changed and used other variables, but we used 3 just to try to keep it simple. And then the state appropriation, we used the no change budget recommendation that I think also aligns with the House and the Senate targets that we can expect that we'll have less appropriation in 26 than in 25. So going through, and what we're trying to focus on is the marginal amounts. So, and this is over the biennium. And of course, the focus is on fiscal year 26 for this upcoming June. Fiscal year 27 tuition rates would be set in June of 26 after contracts or rates are likely known. There have been more state economic forecasts and more information as we get closer to that. The inflation on compensation, so if we do apply 3% to the amount I mentioned, is about $41 million system-wide. The inflation on other costs is about $15 million. We reduce operating appropriations by $35 million, which is at $22.5 million in the operating appropriation and $12.5 million in tuition relief adds up to the 35. And then if tuition was to increase by 3.5% under this scenario, that would generate new tuition revenue for fiscal year 26 of about $26 million. So you can see there's a structural gap of about $65 million, which is just over 3% of the budget. Similarly, we did the same exercise for 5, and the only variable we change is the new tuition revenue. So the modeling of a 5% increase reduces the structural gap to about 2.8% of budget, or $54 million. It's about $7.5 million per 1 percentage point of tuition. So another 1.5% closes the gap by $11.3 million. We modeled 7%. And these were estimates that we shared with the Office of Higher Education in February. We had to come up with estimates so they can estimate their financial program or the financial aid program needs at that time. And at that time, we knew that we were likely to lose appropriation, and that it was that there was a decent chance it could be higher than the normal rate of inflation. So we used the 7% estimate at that time. So looking at that, the structural gap drops to 2.1%. And then the 9% scenario, the structural gap moves even down further to about 24 million. So the ranges are 3.5 to 9, and I'll summarize them here in one slide. This shows the continuum between the 3.5 and the 9%. And just to provide, I know these are numbers that are at a system level, and they might be hard to, what do they really mean? So to try to put some other magnitude behind it. So we have, as a system, we have about, how many employees do we have, FTE-wise? Just over 13,400 FTEs across the system. And if we took average total compensation, which would be salary, wages, insurance benefits, and fringes, and we divide comp by the number of FTEs, it comes out to close to 110,000 per FTE. So the equivalent of that $65 million gap is worth about 592 positions, or 4.4% of our fiscal year 24 FTEs, just to look at it, from a sense of magnitude of what that would look like. And you can see on the chart as you go down what those numbers mean. Another way we decided that might help is that $65 million gap under the 3.5 scenario of our institutions, 2/3 of them have budgets in size that are smaller than 65 million. And then under the 5% scenario, 19 have budgets smaller than 54 million. And then the 7% scenario, about 1/3 of our institutions have budgets that are smaller than 39 million. So just a different way to hopefully provide a little more perspective related to what these structural gaps look like. So another aspect, and we talked about CPI, but if we look, thinking about the chart that was presented before, since fiscal year 2014, when we've had tuition freeze and we've had modest increases, I don't know why they did that. Over that time period, as a system, tuition has increased 1.7% per year since fiscal year 14 until 25. Colleges have increased by 1.3% over that time, and universities have averaged 2.1%. The reason there's a difference is that two of the years the legislature froze two-year college tuition, and they allowed the state university to increase tuition. One year it was 3.4% on average, and another year it was 3.9% per average. So over the course of the last 10 plus years, tuition increases have been less than the rate of inflation. And I think that was ultimately the goal of putting freezes in place and providing additional state funding in many cases to support our tuition revenue. So my last slide, Board Policy 511, tuition and fees. It talks about setting tuition and fees, and that 5 values should be balanced as we go through that process. And the one I focused on today, and all my scenarios talk about, they're focusing on institutional financial sustainability. So it is one of the 5. I'm showing you, projections, that's basic math. Here's what would happen if we do this, basic scenario planning. But there's 4 other values that are very critical to the important decisions that need to be made. Affordable access to higher education, equity, students taking similar academic programs are charged similar rates, transparency, that our students understand their tuition and fee charges, and then flexibility for innovation and emerging markets, which that perhaps is part of or some rationale for differential tuition. But I just wanted to call out that policy language and this stress that the focus today was on the institutional financial sustainability portion of the values, in thinking through what the impact would be for colleges and universities. So that concludes my presentation, and I could certainly go back to any slides as a reference point, but I would turn it over back over to Chair Hipsch for discussion and questions.
Thank you, Vice Chancellor Mackey. If you can go back 2 slides to, I think that might be a good slide to have it sit on for the conversation. Just so that I make sure I'm clear, I believe we need to look at this over the biennium and also keep in mind what's coming in the next biennium. So in the scenario that you have for the 5%, that would be 5% in each of the next 2 years. So in essence, it would be a total of 10% increase over the biennium. Is how I should think about that?
Chair Hipsch, that's correct. So and I'll go back 1 slide. So if I go back to the first one, it would be modeling 3.5% and 20, or I'll use the one you just referred to, 5% in 26, and then another 5% in 27, which over the biennium compounding would be, I think, 10.25%. So that's an assumption that would be similar each year of the biennium, or the same in these scenarios.
And the assumption also is that this is looking at it at the overall across the entire system. Some colleges and universities might be higher or lower. Just overall, it would be the target would be to average out to that number. Is that correct?
Chair Hipsch, that's correct. So we have a system average, we have a sector average, and I included in the packet, though there wasn't a lot of deviation. Even last time tuition was increased in fiscal year 23 or spring of 22. At that time we had one college go 2%, we had most go 3.5, and we had some go 3. So we might even see more variation in what we bring forward, but ultimately there would be a system average that would be there. But the flexibility portion that I mentioned in the biennial budget request envision that there would be some variability amongst institutions.
Thank you. One final question. First off, thank you to the presidents for joining us at the table today. I forgot to do that at the beginning. As you had the conversations with your students, I know it was primarily focused on for fiscal 26, but did you give them a sense for what that would mean then also for fiscal year 27?
Briefly, Chair Hipsch, yes, we've given them some idea that this is an extent financial sustainability issue. But I will tell you, most of them were focused on next year in those conversations.
Yeah, it would be similar at M-State. Students understand the future years. We've certainly given them that information, but our students came together as one student government for the first time this year. So the amount of questions they have just about their own budgets, we used to have 4. This is our first year having 1. So now we've got students in Woodine and Moorhead making choices about how much money we're giving to football and fine arts on other campuses. So they're just in this really intense learning phase about budgets. But I think to reiterate what my colleague said earlier, every time we've gone to our students with tuition increases, they're not crazy about them, especially as we get upwards in the numbers that we're talking about. But they always default to talking about their own campus, their own programs, and more importantly, services provided to students.
Thank you so much. Questions from the trustees? Trustee Grabowska.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ken, you modeled with your students 9.5%, correct?
Correct.
I presume that we were from the 9.5%. That's the red flag, that aligning.
Chair Hipsch, Trustee Gerbowska, I don't know if Bernie's behind me somewhere. He wants to help address this question. Because it does involve providing a legislative opinion. The conversations that we've had is that I think the closer the more we get over a reasonable rate of inflation and closer to that double digits, that it could create some really red flags, particularly to retaining that flexibility that I mentioned near the beginning of the presentation. But Bernie's got good pulse on this discussion.
So, Trustee Kowalska, we haven't had discussions at the legislature, on X percent on tuition. I mean, our overall message was that over the course of the last, I don't know when this started in 2000s of tuition caps and so on, to put the authority back at the board. That's been our overall message. Obviously, looking at the finances that Vice Chancellor Mackey shared with you, it's important to look at how this relates to this biennium and the next biennium as well in your tuition discussions. My instinct is that going in that direction in the first year of the biennium would be a bridge too far. I think just from the cost point of it for students, I struggle frankly with the situation we are all in and try to balance the importance of academic programming and also student costs. But I think to go to that level, I think would cause ripple effect if it's not this legislative session and next. And I would argue for a more measured approach in the scenarios. Probably going to get hit from when I say that, but in the 5% area, I think would be more of a palatable conversation to happen at the legislature. And just my own editorializing, we can't tuition our way out of this thing. We just can't. I mean, we can talk about these numbers, but we're not in a position, I don't think, both for the cost of our students, frankly, and what would be acceptable for this board to the state, to policymakers over the next 4 years. When you start adding up, even going 5% and 5%, and if I were sitting where you are, I'd be looking at that next biennium a little bit harder than even this biennium, and reserving some of that exposure on increasing tuition even more in the next biennium, depending where it goes. And we had a robust conversation about the what's happening at the federal level. And I did talk about this in one of the testimonies, that when this budget reconciliation process ends up going through Congress, either in May or June, July, August, September, the pressures that is going to come to the state of Minnesota is going to be significant. I mean, almost 30% of revenues, total revenues that the state has, is from the federal government. And while that doesn't mean that there's a line that says Minnesota State gets X dollar amount, but if you're blowing holes in other areas of the budget, you know how it all plays out at the legislature as far as priorities and protecting some of the most vulnerable in our society. So my editorial would be, protect yourself on maintaining the tuition at the board level. It appears that the legislature is there, but they're not in a place where they're going to look, I don't believe, kindly on massive increases. And again, I can't stress enough the next biennium, because I think that's where it gets very, very difficult for us as a system in how it all play out in the federal context. And that's even enjoying a reasonable economy, where a few weeks ago, people are changing their belief on the probability of a recession. And I'm certainly, that's not my area of expertise. I just read what I see. And if you put in recessionary figures, Trustee Moe knows this better than anybody. You put those recessionary figures inside of the state budget forecast. And the state budget forecast is not how much money is in the bank, it's how much money we expect to have in the bank. You have a compounding effect like I don't know if I've ever seen anything like this. So that would be my caution. And I know it's easy for me to say I'm not at the table balancing budgets at the campus level, but I'm just giving you the advice that I see in the debate we've had at the legislature. And before Trustee Janicic says it's all about the lobbying efforts, I will just say personally, being at 0-0 is an honest win for where we are at the legislature. And it sounds strange, but it is in context of the other budgets and how other reductions are being made in the other line items at the legislature.
Chancellor Ross, did you want to jump in first?
Thanks, Chair. So I just wanted to make a little more explicit something that was implicit in what Bernie said, and that is, if you could imagine two scenarios, one where we went for 9.5 this time, but then we had 0 next time, and 0 and 0 in the next biennium because the legislature decides to take back tuition setting. Where then are we at the end of the next biennium versus if we were a little more moderate this time and did 5 and then maybe 5 and 5 and 5. And then where does that leave us at the end of the next biennium? So that's what Bernie's really talking about. The legislature is giving back to the board now the ability to set tuition, but it's with the expectation that the board will exercise wisdom around all these things, and they could pull it back. They could take back the ability to set tuition.
Sure. Very quickly, could we hear from the presidents then? I mean, if you were modeling 9.5, what's 5 do to your campuses?
For our campus, it'd be about a reduction of $5 million, which would require a reduction in force.
We haven't modeled that high of a number at M-State and just part of our state and the region we serve. We modeled it to the students, but in our actual budget, we've not modeled that. We've modeled more around the center of this number. But the reality is, and I hope I'm speaking on behalf of all of my the presidential colleagues that I sit here to represent, we're in a really interesting time in that we're asking hard questions about who we are moving forward. So I think about the strategic plan for the system, the question from earlier. I mean, those are, having 4 campuses, having the amount of square footage that we have, having, can we have financial aid available to students 5 days a week, or registration, or pick the service, what does that look like moving forward? Those are the conversations that we're having as we look forward for the next few years. It fundamentally changes what we can offer and where. Not just this year, we're a financially healthy college, so we could be fine for several years. But as I look across the state and the system, I think there's real big questions that we have to answer in order to get through this next couple bienniums.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Bill, thank you for the inflation chart. I was going to ask about that. So our tuition over time has stayed less than inflation. The problem is, just like in business, predictability and evenness are what matter, and going 0.009 or 0.005, it's better to be kind of steady state. I realize we have not had that control. Having listened to some of the hearings at the legislature, too many of those people don't know what they're doing. I'm not going to name names. One of them represents you, Jerry. Anyway, on the enrollment assumptions and these various percent increases, we're assuming steady enrollment and no elasticity of demand, Or are we assuming elasticity of demand?
Chair Hipsch, Trustee Erlinson, for these scenarios, we assume stable enrollment.
Sorry, back in the day, I think before everybody here, we had the Benson chart, we called it. It might be beneficial now, particularly for the legislature. So what it did was it showed, you may remember this. Yeah. So it showed what a student actually pays based on what quintile of income they're in. Because people don't pay the same. And so what matters with the Promise program and the Pell Grant are going to hold harmless the lowest income people, even if we increase tuition 100%. Right. So I realize there are Pell Grant shortages and Promise and state grant problems, but generally they're going to pay virtually nothing no matter what the tuition rate is. So it would just be helpful to maybe dust that off and bring it back to see in these scenarios what people actually pay out of pocket. We realize some students pay whatever the price tag is, and it's still a bargain compared to other schools that I know. So that might be another helpful thing. I'm interested in the competitive set that President Jans mentioned, particularly for the universities, but also the 2 years that are on borders. And what are they charging 50 miles away in Iowa? They don't have 2-year schools in Wisconsin, right? They go to, oh, they do? Well, the technical, I know about the technical colleges. They don't have two.
They have very few community colleges.
Okay, so, but or North Dakota or whatever. I think all that would be helpful for us, but hopefully it might be helpful for decision makers at the Capitol too.
Trustee Richter. Your mic.
How much would we need to increase tuition over the next 2 years to close the gap to zero? And then a follow-up question. Right now, the enrollment or the estimate is based on stable enrollment. But say we increase enrollment by increase tuition by 9%. I can almost guarantee you some students would drop out. Do we have any guesstimate or estimate on what the percentage would be and how that would affect the budget?
Chair Hipsch, Trustee Richter. So to your first question, in order to completely fill the gap, tuition would need to increase 11.8% each year to get to zero. That's just how the math works. Related to the impact of tuition increases on enrollment, it's complicated. So there's a lot of different factors that go into place. Even referring back when we had cuts and we had some fairly significant tuition increases, at that time our enrollment was actually increasing as a system because the economy, workers were retraining because they were laid off. The demographics were favorable to Minnesota State. The financial aid programs have an impact. So I don't think we have any way of knowing that if tuition goes up X, this is the impact on enrollment, or X plus 2, might be 2% less. I think it's more complicated than that. And maybe some of our enrollment management colleagues would have more information on that. But, Trustee Erlinson's point was a good one. The amount of financial aid available and how it impacts what the net cost is for students is a critical variable in trying to, speculate on that.
Trustee Johnson.
I hardly know where to begin. I mean, so many questions and so complicated, and I really appreciate the points that several people have made that we're just talking about tuition. It's one lever to pull. It's not the only one. And I do feel, and I'm not sure how or where the conversation needs to go from these sort of smaller things that we can impact to bigger questions about the system itself. The levers to pull, I see them are, some things are given, inflation, the number of employees, right? How much employees are paid, how much tuition we're charging students, the number of programs, the number of campuses. And I feel like talking just about this one thing isn't really going to get us where we need to be as a system in trying to imagine the future. I know, Vice President Mackey, that you and I would both like the crystal ball to be able to do that. So that's just my comment. I do have a whole bunch of questions. I'll just raise a few of them now so as not to take up too much airtime. But related to your question, I think I asked this at our previous meeting. It would really be helpful if we're just talking about tuition for me to know what the tuition discount is by sector. So it's related to the question, not so much in terms of quintile data, but more colleges across the country calculate tuition discounts. So what is the tuition discount by sector, the community college, technical college sector, and the university sector? That would be helpful to know as a trustee. The other data point that I think would be helpful to know as we're trying to focus just on tuition would be what is the average student debt when they leave the institution, also by sector. I think I didn't do this, but the questions came to me as I was reading through the materials. I think that information is available at the clearinghouse. And I think the higher ed clearinghouse, I think you can, as a parent, you can get on and see what the debt is. I think that would also be helpful to know. And I'm not suggesting that tuition doesn't matter, but it would be helpful to know who is paying full cost. Probably not very many students. That would be my guess. And what is the loan burden that students are leaving with? So those are questions that would be helpful to have data related to, but I think the bigger question, and I feel like we're just not there, it's not like I know how to get there, is this question about looking at the future, thinking about what's going on in the country at the federal government with our leadership. What are we going to do in order to preserve those system values that are really at the foundation of what we're doing? And maybe we can't just keep doing things in the same way. I'll just finish by saying, again, a question: are there other models of systems that have done things differently and taken more drastic and dramatic steps in order to be sustainable? So thank you.
Vice Chancellor Mackey, any response that you want to touch on?
Chair Hipsch, Trustee Johnson, we can look at getting some of those data points to be, part of the first reading when we come back in May to talk further about the 26 budget and tuition. I know we have access for sure to the loan debt data by sector, and we'll look into the discounting data too.
Your questions, Trustee Johnson.
This has been great, and I think I'm going to ask a question that just adds to what everybody has been saying here. Just looking at the financials, if we went to 3.5% over the biennium, it means 120 million that were in the hole, right? $130. I can't add. So then the question, Chancellor, is strategically, what are our options to close that gap? Bernie suggests we should go in with the zero tuition increase, which would make it even more. And $5 million is a hardship on a flagship institution like Winona. So imagine the smaller schools, $1 million here, $1 million there. But what are our strategic options? I would be interested in that. You don't obviously have to respond now. And the needs of our students are changing too. And this is my being new, but it feels like students of today are far different than they were before COVID and before everything was online. And so how will our institutions meet those changing needs, et cetera?
Chair Hipsch, Trustee Johnson, there's an operating strategy and then perhaps a revenue strategy that each institution could have at its disposal. So the operating challenges and strategy is sort of what Trustee Jackie Johnson was talking about, which is reinventing, re-engineering, changing how we do things, looking at how others do it. The system office is in the process of doing this. All of our campuses, as President Jans was saying, have been looking at this minimally, and some of them have been in the state of re-engineering as they go, trying to figure out ways to not be everything to everybody, to do some of the things they must do in different ways, leaner. Strategically, there's maybe slightly fewer options there, but new programs or new ways of delivering existing programs can create revenue opportunities. Part of that would be especially for, we have two presidents here who sit on a border. President Jan's out his window can see Wisconsin. And President Brimhall doesn't have to look too far to see North Dakota. And so they find themselves in a situation where they have to be very balanced in not pricing themselves out of a very competitive market, and meanwhile having the quality and the programs that the folks locally would expect of them. We've got a great group of presidents who all the time are trying to sharpen their pencil and figure out where can they redline some things, where can they introduce new things that produce new revenue, where are there groups of students that we haven't served well that we could bring in and help be successful, and that's part of what's behind Equity 2030, because that's where the growth is in Minnesota. That's where the growth is. And non-traditional students, incumbent workers who might want to, not 18-year-olds, who might want to come back and learn something new, get some new skills, if not a degree, maybe a certificate of some kind. So all those things are on the table. The mix is different at each campus and what they can tolerate. And we'll just have to keep working down that path of finding operating savings while also looking for new sources of revenue. And other than that, I don't necessarily have a single answer for all the institutions represented here. Each of them has their own kind of pool of opportunities.
Councilor Olson, can you also talk to, I know your example there was really with inside of an institution and that, but what opportunities are we exploring looking regionally or across if you can touch on that?
Trustee Hitch, so there already exist shared services that exist across the system. There are most of what you hear about here when we're talking about shared services are things that are system-wide and often system-controlled services, but those aren't the only ones that exist. And within regions and within campus dyads, this campus and that campus forming partnerships, there are a lot of opportunities there that we can explore to save money and find new revenue and really rethink things. Distance Minnesota would be an example. It's currently being led by Alexandria Community and Technical College. That's an example of a non-system office consortium of institutions that get together to deliver distance education. Winona State historically had a partnership with Minnesota State College Southeast, where Southeast contracted with Winona State. I don't know if they still do, President Jansiak, to deliver security, campus security. It seemed redundant to have two full security details when the two campuses are 1.5 miles apart. So those would be things well worth exploring. And these presidents have a lot of creative ideas about how in their own neighborhood and backyard they can partner in new ways, belt tighten in new ways, find new sources of revenue. There's a lot there. And we can have future discussions about that here too, about ways to do that. The system office itself, like I said, is going through a process of reinventing itself. And this is due to its own, the belt tightening exercise it needs to be embarking on and asking itself, how can we do things differently? How can we be leaner?
I'd be very interested in seeing more of those examples and seeing more of those options come forward at the board. Trustee Mo.
Thank you, Chair Hitch. if we, I'm going to ask a question at the end of all of this that doesn't need to be answered. It just needs to be pondered. Okay. We've had the presentation about the state budget and the situation that the overall state budget is in and how it relates to Minnesota State. Like Bernie, I'm not an economist, but I read the newspapers and I read the reports about consumer confidence and is the economy headed in the right direction or the wrong direction? You all are reading the same stories I've been reading. We have a federal administration that we're going to live with now for 3.5 or more years. A Secretary of Education who admitted she doesn't know anything about education and then went on to proceed to tell you about how A1 is going to help higher education. We have situations where in our bargaining where we are obviously heavily we have our system is people oriented and 75-80% of our system is staff, and we are victims to another state negotiating, and yet it has an impact on our system. We have this discussion about tuition and to what degree, all tough questions. So we have all of this uncertainty. And so I just simply want to close with this. And I want you to think about it. In 2029, will M State look like M State in 2025? Just think about it. In light of what we're going to face, and Chair Hips, you're right. We have to look at this in a 3-year time scheme. Otherwise, we're going to have whoever's here in 2029 is going to have real problems. Thank you.
Trustee Sill. Thank you, Chair. Thanks for everyone. All your questions and comments have been excellent. We front-loaded this discussion on budget and tuition earlier in the year than is typical because it's a challenging and difficult decision, especially this year, with all the factors that Trustee Mo has identified. We'll look forward to the campus consultations and hearing from the student associations, the bargaining units, and all of our constituents. We're focused on Board Policy 5.11, which Vice Chancellor Mackey identified policies for setting tuition and fees, and the competition, of course, is to some extent between affordable access, criterion number 1, and institutional financial sustainability, criterion number 4. And we will be deliberative and I think measured. Just a couple of quick questions, and I apologize. And by the way, I do know how to spell AI, but our decision in June, is it just on the 25-26 school year tuition? Chair Sol, yes, it's to set tuition for the 25-26 school year. We'll set tuition for 26-27. Correct. June of 26, we'll set tuition for 26-27. Okay, and question for President Jans. When you are doing your modeling at 9.5%, is that for 25-26 or 25-26 and 26-27?
Specifically 25-26. That's what we've modeled on for the 9.5. It would have to be similar the following year, most likely, but it depends on tails of contract negotiations and all those things. There's a lot of stuff we have to be concerned about in there.
Okay. Well, we can defer, keep in mind, but defer the decision on the next year until next year. But, 20% is what you're talking about. Sounds like a big sticker shock to me. And I realize everyone in this room, because I don't think the student associations are here, probably would have a better life at 20%. But we're here to think about everyone, including our students and the potential loss of students. And I can't believe that if we offer free tuition and our enrollment goes up substantially, that raising the tuition by double digits wouldn't depress our enrollment. And maybe not on the promised students, because the state will pay the increase in tuition. But for the families that make $81,000 a year, I think a 20% increase would be problematic. So I will keep an open mind. I'm sure that we all will. We'll hear from a number of others over the course of the next couple of months, and we'll do the best that we can.
Any final comments before we wrap up today? Vice Chancellor Mackey, any additional questions or anything you need from us in today's meeting?
Thanks, Chair Hips. I think we've gotten some good suggestions of additional information to help the trustees with this important decision that we'll work on as staff.
With that, we are already 5 minutes over our planned time, and the start of conversations. There will be many more conversations to come on it. With that, I will adjourn this committee meeting, and our next one will be starting at 2:30.